I'm Richard Johnson, a professor emeritus in history here at the University of Washington. Thank you for joining us for the second lecture of the 2023 History Lecture Series, Medieval Made Modern, given by Professor Emerita Robin Stacey. Particular welcome to I believe we have a body of students from Roosevelt High School. Well, welcome. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Stacey tonight. An honor because I have long stood in awe of her remarkable scholarship, her prize-winning books, her international renown as a leader in medieval and Celtic studies, as was well described by Dean Harris last week. Indeed, I believe I can feel a particular admiration for what Robin has done for so long, so well, for I will admit to being myself a one-time lapsed medievalist in a former century and in a country far away. It was only when I came to the United States and realized I could read American much faster than I could read Latin, that I turned to study and teach early American history, its medieval years. But with this inheritance, I feel I can fully recognize the great skills of law and language that she has needed to work in this field and which she has brought so magnificently to her scholarship. And secondly, it's a pleasure to introduce her, for I have long been her colleague as a teacher in the Department of History, so that I've seen firsthand how she has not only recovered and recounted the past, but has brought it to life and given it meaning for her students in innovative ways. I only had to venture out of my office in Smith Hall while she was teaching her renowned courses, Medieval Mysteries and Reacting to the Past, to find Smith's corridors thronged with noblemen, bishops, inquisitors, and the occasional warrior on their way to reenactment she staged, such as the trial of Joan of Arc. The composition of this audience tonight shows how many of her former students seek to return again to accompany her back into the world of medieval history. Moreover, her teaching has embraced the added dimension of showing how that world has provided subsequent generations with images and legends by which to interpret their own experiences. Thus, her courses on the magical fairy worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, and indeed this series of lectures. Through them all run her passionate interest in bringing back to light the legacy of the Celtic peoples and their civilization to world history. And this will be evident in her lecture tonight on the Arthurian legend that has spread worldwide, but which emerged out of ancient Western Britain as the British Celts resisted the Anglo-Saxon invasions. As one who grew up reading Thomas Malory's Mortar, Tennyson's Idol of the King, and T.H. White's Once and Future King, I can attest to the lasting power of the Arthurian legend and the way it has infused Britain's romantic nationalism. I know, too, that but for the untimely youthful death of Henry VII's eldest son, England might have had a line of King Arthurs, passing over all those Georges, Jameses, and Williams, and not to mention Prince Arthur's brother, the Spare, who became the monstrous Harry VIII. Tintagel and Glastonbury might now be the seats of power and not the sites of tourist fascination and musical festival groupies. So what Robin has to offer us is both a vision of history as it might have been, and as it has been reimagined by different generations to enrich the needs of the present. Both are implicit in the title of her lecture tonight, both the once and the future. So I give you Professor Robin Stacey speaking on Arthur, Quondam Rex, Rex qui Futurus. Thank you.
I have to turn this one off, I think. Okay. That sound, everybody can hear me, more or less? Great, excellent, thank you very much, Richard. I too bemoan the fact that we don't have a line of Arthurs. That would have been kind of cool. And a definite shout out to the Roosevelt people. My son graduated from there 2006, so, you know, go green and gold, what can I say? And thank you guys all for coming out tonight. And tonight we are going to, let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Right. Tonight we're going to look at our first sort of individual. Last time we looked at the mythical group of dragons. Tonight we're going to look at someone who might be mythical, might be historical, who knows? We'll talk about that, King Arthur here. We live in a world of Arthurs. It did not take me long at all to find a ton of Arthurs when I went out there looking. There are pre-Raphaelite Arthurs and pre-Raphaelite adjacent Arthurs. There are chess figure Arthurs. There are action figure Arthurs. This guy, something's going wrong there. Don't know what I'm going to say about that. There are little doll Arthurs, gaming Arthurs. Plus, I assume that's Guinevere, but it's kind of hard to tell. I certainly wouldn't cross her. There are comic Arthurs, creepy wax head Arthurs. Annie Leibovitz doing an ad for Disney. Arthur starring Roger Federer, whatever, the tennis guy. Alcoholic Arthurs. Volkswagen ad Arthurs. Don't ask me. I have no explanation for this one, but I like the umbrella. Trees named Arthur, although alas, this one is no longer with us, as you can see. Yeah, I know, this is the first time I've ever shown this slide where the tree was no longer with us, alas. There are presidential candidate Arthurs. And believe it or not, I did not make any of this up. This is in 2016. A hotel had made him a Knight of the Round Table, and Camelot Castle apparently awarded him an honorary knighthood. So there you are. You can say it, I can't, so. And then there are Arthurs for which I have never had any explanation at all. This one is just bizarre, not just because it's flower, but because that's a Templar. So we're way off Arthur here. But I did enjoy coming across this ancient version of the King Arthur flower slogan, leading the way to better bread and pastry. But what I particularly liked was this. Particular housewives have used it for years, because this implies in a binary world the existence of unparticular housewives who are ready to use just any old garbage to make their bread. I'm pretty sure that's where I would be, but there we are. So all of these Arthurs are out there, and even more, as you can see. He's quite a ubiquitous figure in all sorts of genres, venues, etc. And then, of course, there's the Arthur we know. The Arthur that you may have read about, perhaps growing up, or fairy stories of, or you've seen movies of, or whatever. Certain characteristics of this Arthur, as most people would now define him. Of course, the King of Britain, the Round Table, Guinevere, perhaps Mordred, Lancelot, the Sword and the Stone, Excalibur, the idea that he's not really dead, but is just sleeping and will come to serve Britain's call. These are all aspects of the Arthur that we have inherited. We are literally the beneficiary of centuries of reimagining of Arthur, and this is the result. This is not where he first began. As you can imagine, there's quite a controversy about whether or not Arthur existed as a historical figure. And one of the interesting things about this debate is that there's a marked difference in the literature between popular histories, which tend to take the position that he did exist, and academic histories, which tend more towards the opposite. It's not universal rule, but it's certainly noticeable. And that's interesting because I wouldn't have said the same was true for Robin Hood scholarship, for example, which we'll talk about next week. Whoops, wait a minute. I thought this was a laser pointer. I've got, too many things to play with up here. Jeffrey Ashe has been for years was for years, one of the leading figures of the Yes, Arthur Existed camp. His place has been taken by this guy, Christopher Gidlow. Both of these are people who were well-educated, but existed in the popular realms of popular history, and they've both wrote quite a lot. Ashe wrote quite a lot, in fact, on with the intent of proving that Arthur existed as an historical figure. And then there are the opposite. I'm doing it again. Here, the opposite. This is just one scholar among many, David Dumville, who has as far as I'm concerned, one of the great sentences of all times regarding sort of Arthur and does he exist. Arthur is a product of the no smoke without fire school of history, meaning that people want to believe in him because there's so much out there written about him. Which is an interesting perception and one that you might keep in mind as we progress through this evidence. Now, if he did exist, there are two leading historical candidates, one of which you'll be probably more familiar with than the other. Indeed, Richard already mentioned the one you're more familiar with, probably the Romano-British leader fighting against the incoming Germans. But this is the guy that I would say, if anybody is more likely to be pegged as the historical Arthur, this is the guy that I think more people would point to. He's an actual Roman commander of two British legions that were stationed up in the north of Roman Britain, was stationed up there sometime in the late 2nd and early 3rd century of the Common Era. And one of the great things about him, and one of the attractive things about him, is that we know he actually existed. And we know he existed because there are 3 inscriptions that are still left that testify to him. Probably all 3 raised by him. Certainly the longest of the inscriptions was raised by him. The other 2 just have his name, basically. But I've sort of copied out the one of them here, and you can see that he sort of talks about who he is, what positions he's held in the Roman army. And the key thing for us here is 2 things. First of all, his name, Artorius, which is indeed a name known in Roman Latin circles. The Artoria were, in fact, a minor noble family in and around Rome, so that's a legit Roman name. And then the fact that he was a prefect of the 6th Legion Vitrix, which was a legion of Roman soldiers that served up in the north of Britain. And this means that this guy with a potential name Arthur, or who could have been known as Arthur, served up in that area of northern Britain, and at a time early enough, late 2nd, early 3rd century, where if he had been a great warrior, and this we don't know anything about, we just have these inscriptions, but if he had been a great warrior, there might have been time for great stories to grow up around him to make him into the sort of mythical war leader that Arthur is when he first emerges into the sources. So that's one sort of plus in his favor. The second possible Arthur is this one, and this is the one Richard mentioned earlier. This is a Romano-British war leader, and what we're referring to here is the Romans leave Britain in and around 410 of the Common Era. They have to beat it back to the continent because things are not going well there, and they leave the Britons to their defenses, to their own defenses. At that time, Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, etc., speaking the ancestor of the language that I'm speaking to you in tonight, come in and start taking over large parts of the country. So that you're looking here at historians' guess about what a map of Britain would look like circa 600 of the Common Era. And as you can tell, much of it has been taken over already by these Old English, by these Anglo-Saxons, but much of it remains still British. And British, the language would have been what we would think of as Old Welsh. You could call it British, you could call it Old Welsh, but it stretched, this Old Welsh British culture stretched not only from what is modern-day Wales, but all the way up into the north of Britain as well. Now, how does this relate to Arthur? Because one of the earliest ideas about Arthur, and it's still the most common one to find in literature, both fabulous literature and historical literature about him, is that Arthur, the real historical Arthur, was one of these Romano-British war leaders, a British war leader, perhaps someone claiming Roman descent or Roman office or whatever in the wake of the withdrawal of the Romans, and that he was fighting against the Saxons to drive them back out of Britain. That is the standard historical Arthur that is usually offered up. Certainly Geoffrey Ashe, Christopher Gidlow, the people I mentioned before, are very much partisans of that particular Arthur. So there they are, but why can't we tell? I mean, shouldn't we be able to tell where this idea of an Arthur comes from? Well, the problem is because of sources. I mean, basically, you're looking here at the sources that exist. The normal time period for Arthur, 400 to 600 of the Common Era in Britain, has so few sources, it's like a black hole. I mean, there's just nothing really there to tell us. So I have put on here basically all the sources for Arthur, the historical sources. And you'll see that these top three here, A, B, and C, they are historical sources in being sources that come from or close to the time we think Arthur might have lived, but none of them mention Arthur. So these are Arthurian sources that are Arthurian sources by virtue of talking about a time when Arthur would have lived, except they don't mention Arthur. So I think we all see that that's a little thin as evidence goes. No Latin source mentions Arthur before the 9th century, history of the Britons, and we'll look at some of that. And the only Welsh source to mention him earlier is very controversial and problematic. So there is a verse that I'm going to show you in just a minute, just one stanza basically, from this wonderful Welsh collection of poems, of eulogies of fallen heroes, heroes who had fought in a battle at Catraeth, probably modern-day Catterick in Yorkshire. And this is a series of eulogies praising these heroes fighting in the battles and praising the way they die. One stanza of that mentions Arthur. But here's the thing. It's quite possible that the oldest section of those poems, of this thing called the Gododdin, it's possible that it goes back to the 7th or even the 6th century. But it's by no means certain. There are two versions of the Gododdin poems, and usually historians say, well, if it's old, it's probably in both of them, and it's not, it's only in one. So that's pretty doubtful. And then that's it. It's just a single stanza. After that, the Welsh sources, all 9th or 10th century. So the only thing we can really say here is that all of the evidence to date that we have, all of the written evidence that we have for an historical Arthur, dates to several centuries after he would have lived, which makes it very, very difficult to rely on any of this as historically showing the presence of a real Arthur. You can see why the Roman Arthur looks pretty good, because we know that guy lived, right? But these, not so much. Furthermore, when you look at the nature of what this evidence says, you'll see that... Oh. Okay, is that better? Can people hear me? Okay. Thank you. I would never have noticed. The literature, the nature of the literature that comes from this period, even when it does mention Arthur, already very literary, heroic in character. It looks already like this is an Arthur that is reimagined. That has been reimagined, that's possibly mythical in character. Again, not the sort of sound, sober historical evidence that historians normally look for. This is the stanza I mentioned from the old Welsh poems. It's talking about a hero, a particular hero, and it praises him by comparison with Arthur. You know, he killed a lot of people. He fed black ravens, of course, carrion birds, on the wall of the fortress, though he was not Arthur. Suggests right there, you know, yeah, he was pretty good. He wasn't as good as Arthur, but he was pretty good. He killed a lot of people, but not as many as Arthur would have done. Again, sort of, you know, Arthur is superhero, not very precise historically anyway. The history of the Britons. Here you see the claim that 960 men fall from a single attack of Arthur, and he was the only one involved. I think we're entitled to be a little suspicious of that. And then this Welsh, wonderful, very creepy and mysterious series of poem, The Spoils of Annwn. This is a story about how King Arthur and his men raid the other world in search of a magical cauldron, right? Already not exactly a somber historical moment, and this is what it says: except for 7, none returned from the otherworld fortress, none before Arthur had gone into it. So this is the nature of the evidence. This is the date of the evidence. So you can see that we're pretty lost. Unless something else happens, people will keep writing books about this forever, and keep, you know, repeating it forever, pretty much. It's going to be very hard to get anything specific from that. Furthermore, the nature and the dates and all the problems that I've outlined with the evidence has led a number of academic specialists here in the Arthurian period to suggest that we're really kind of asking the wrong question. This guy, Oliver Paddle, he's a brilliant Celtic place names person, and I was amazed to find he was the great-great-grandson of Charles Darwin. Who knew? He has proposed, just looking at the nature of the references to Arthur, that Arthur was always fictional. He was always a kind of superhero. He was always a mythic guy. And in fact, he points out Arthur fits this kind of known story pattern from Celtic myth, which imagines heroes from within the tribe, meaning, you know, heroes who are within the community, who defend the community. And then another type of hero, heroes outside the tribe, those who are wandering in the forests and doing heroic acts out there. Arthur seems to fit the latter category in the types of actions that he's imagined as doing. So he's proposing that Arthur is a hero, a story pattern hero, right from the earliest time we can see anything about him. A similar idea, slightly different in emphasis, was proposed by Nicholas Higham, great archaeologist, historian. And what he's arguing here is not just that Arthur is an evidence of story pattern, he's actually an evidence of what we were talking about last week, of the reuse of either historical or mythical creatures in myth for particular political purposes. And this book of Highams, which is not his only one, but certainly one that I think is worthy of taking notice here, he goes through and he shows how the various that appear in those sources that I put up here earlier that mention him, how those fit into British politics of the period in which the source was written. In other words, these are mythical accounts and aimed at historical situations in much the same way that the movies that we're going to see in a minute or two, well, in a few minutes there, made in the 20th century can speak to 20th century situations and political quandaries. Together they're raising two different questions. First of all, was he always fictional or mythical? Was he always imagined and not real? And secondly, might he be an example of a fictional character who gets historicized? In other words, someone who starts as fiction, but then is reimagined so frequently and so effectively in so many historical accounts that people come to believe that he's historical. And if this is true, this makes it particularly interesting because one of the guys who is mentioned as an historical figure in those early sources I had up before that don't mention Arthur, they mention this guy Ambrosius. He seems to be a real guy, as far as we could tell, really one of these Romano-British war leaders. And guess what? He gets mythologized. He turns up as ultimately a character who gets conflated with Merlin. So we might have two different sort of processes going here where the fictional becomes history and the historical becomes fiction. Both common, not surprising, but certainly gives us a different sense of what we might be looking at here trying to write the history of this period. Now, that brings us to the question of, so where does the Arthur that we know come from? Where do we get this? And the answer to that question must start with this guy, Geoffrey of Monmouth, here, and a work he composed 1136, 1138, the Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, one of the most famous sources from this period, and absolutely a watershed in our understanding of Arthur. So Geoffrey of Monmouth, his second name is Arthur, so that may suggest, there's some sort of interest. He appears to have been born in Wales or near Wales, although there's no real indication that he had a great deal of Welsh language. He might have had a French or Breton background, that's uncertain. For most of his career, he's a very high status, high visibility cleric in and around various places in Oxford, in England, and Wales. And his book, Historia Regum Britanniae, known as the HRB for obvious reasons, becomes a medieval bestseller. This is absolutely, you can kind of tell, or at least one indication of when a book is really doing well, sales-wise, popularity-wise in the Middle Ages, is how many manuscripts are produced of it. And look at there are 200 manuscripts extant today of this. And that's super unusual. It gets almost instantly translated into a variety of European languages, and many of the translations themselves are kind of translations that become works on their own, literary works on their own, that then have, in turn, an influence on works that come after them. Geoffrey of Monmouth is also used in a number of historical chronicles that are produced in this period by a variety of different cultures and nations, including Poland as well, and Old Norse. So his work, not only a bestseller, but it becomes a sort of history that is immediately picked up and adopted. And this is important because Geoffrey talks about Arthur a lot. Arthur is one of the centerpieces of this work, and he adds, in his stories about Arthur, he brings up in written form, for the first time that we know of, many of the now traditional ideas about Arthur. Many of the things that you see, I've made a list here of some of them, many of the things that you will probably know if you grew up on Arthur at all, make their first appearance in writing here in Geoffrey. Among them, the treachery of Mordred and Guinevere. The Battle of Camelot is actually mentioned in an earlier source, but the Isle of Avalon, Excalibur, which they think comes from, Geoffrey calls the sword Caliburnus, but we think Excalibur is what it mutates into in Romance tradition. His magic conception at Tintagel. In other words, a lot of the present-day Arthurian myths appear for the first time in Geoffrey. Now, of course, the question is, where does he get it? Is this reliable at all? Can we trust this guy at all? Geoffrey tells us himself that he used a certain ancient book in the British language, meaning in Welsh. Well, as I said, for one thing, we're not sure he knew much Welsh, if any. For another one, no one's ever found this book. I mean, and there is deep suspicion, shall we say, as to whether it ever existed. Some people have suggested, well, he may have gotten hold of a Welsh genealogical collection or something, but no, no book that contains all of these stories, or even some of them, has ever been found. And we actually think that Geoffrey probably got it from oral tradition. I mean, there is clearly already a really lively oral tradition going on about Arthur. And Geoffrey has Breton connections through his family, and it's pretty clear that these tales are circulating in his milieu. He may be the first to write them down. He may also give shape to them and give details that he's adding in himself. We don't know. But we're really quite sure that there's a already very lively oral tradition. One of the reasons we're sure of that is because one of the earlier Arthurian sources from this period is this, sculpture. I mean, you may not think of sculpture as being a historical source, but in this case it is. It's an archivolt, an arch, on the cathedral in Modena, Italy. And I put up the map there as to where it is, so northern Italy. And it has an Arthurian story here. So it's hard to see, but there's a castle up here, and within the castle, Winlogi, form of Guinevere, is languishing, having been captured for, she's about to be captured by a million people, but here she is, in one of the early ones. And the knights are trying to rescue her. And how do we know this is an Arthur myth? Because conveniently they label it. One of our problems with the earlier sources, like the history of the Britons, the earliest sources, is that even those who come from the Arthurian age don't tell us who wrote it, or where it's written, or anything like that. But here we've got convenient labels, so we know that this is an Arthur story, and it features Arthur, Kay, Sir Kay is in here, Guinevere, the guy who's going to become the evil Malagant in a different name, and a person that may or may not be Gawain. So this is evidence already of stories, and if you're wondering how it gets down to Italy, the Normans, when they conquered England in 1066, didn't just go to England. They went all over Europe looking for kingdoms to win, and one of the places they settled in was Italy, particularly the southern areas of Italy and the kingdom of Sicily. So the thinking is that probably Breton storytellers accompanying these Norman lords bring this Arthurian lore down with them, and that's how come we've got this. Another one, this one post-Geoffrey, the other one was probably pre-Geoffrey, but it's really amusing, is also in Italy, in the heel of the boot here, circa 1165, after Geoffrey, but before the big Romance tradition develops. And it's a cool one, because we're not quite sure what's going on here. So we are sure that he's Rex Arturus. Okay, so we've got that. We've got King Arthur. Why he appears to be riding a goat? Can't help you with that one. Why he's standing next to Abel, and by the way, Cain is up here also. Can't help you with that one either. And then there's this thing this kind of spotted cat. So we can do one of two things. We can either say, this is evidence of a story we no longer know, and evidence of the fact that oral tradition is often much larger than written tradition, and some of it is just plain lost. Or one idea I've read recently is that there is evidence in later Arthurian sources for a fight between Arthur or one of Arthur's knights, usually Kay, between them and this Cath Palig, a big nasty cat. And here we're thinking not of the cats that might be roaming around your house at this very moment, decimating toy mice. We're thinking of some big, patchy, huge cat that kills people. There are stories of this and Arthur fighting that cat that come up later in written tradition. So it's possible that that's what this is. It doesn't explain why Arthur's on a goat. I mean, we have no idea. But if nothing else, it makes 2 points. One, oral tradition is very rich. And two, it's spread already over Europe. It's not just Britain. It's not just even France. It's in Europe as well. And then there's the political aspects of Geoffrey's work, HRB. And here I've kind of phrased it a little aggressively, more aggressively than I intend. But the basic upshot is this. In 1066, Normans from the west of France cross over to England and conquer it. And they establish a cross-channel kingdom that lasts till about 1204 in that shape. At the time the Normans cross, they have to defeat the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons, the ancestors of the Old English. They're the guys that Arthur fought too. And one of the things you can see in Geoffrey's account of Arthur is that he's very cleverly implying that the Normans are, in defeating the Saxons, are fighting on the same side Arthur did. So he's presenting Arthur as the great British fighter against the Saxons, with the implication of his work being, we Normans, we're also fighting against those Saxons. We're on the same side that Arthur is. So what we're seeing here is the actual appropriation by Geoffrey, this good, French or Welsh, whoever he was, good English cleric, if nothing else, the appropriation by Geoffrey of Arthur. Arthur fought the Saxons, we fought the Saxons, we're on the same side. That's the implication of this. And this is ironic because the Normans are, at the time Geoffrey is writing, conquering and occupying large parts of Wales, of Old Britain. So this is a blatant, I'd hesitate to use the word lie, but shall we say fib? But it's a fib, it's a myth with political content. Again, it is a reimagining of Arthur in a particular political circumstance for a particular reason. Now, another place where Arthur gets reimagined, and this one is quite fun, is here. So, some of you may have been to Glastonbury. And if you have, you've probably seen more crystal shops and new age things than you've ever seen before. Glastonbury had long had claimed associations with magic, with Joseph of Arimathea, and eventually would claim associations with the Holy Grail. In 1184, Glastonbury Abbey experiences a devastating fire, and they need money to rebuild the church. In 1191, they announce that they have discovered King Arthur's tomb on the grounds. And guess what happens? Pilgrims, tourists, everybody pours in, makes huge donations, and I should say that the church that resulted from this is really quite nice indeed. It gets built up, and you can see that if you go there today, they will show you where the tomb was. This was a fairly elaborate hoax They claim to have dug down a certain number of feet, like 10 feet, and found the bones of a very, very tall man and the bones of a small blonde-haired female with him. There's a cross that no longer exists, but this is a drawing made of that cross in 1607. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon. You know, a good reminder, if you're ever going to create a historical artifact, make sure you date it and label it. That's very helpful. So this is completely false, completely a forgery, but served its purpose, right, to prove that these were the bones of Arthur. And you see here Gerald of Wales, who hated Geoffrey of Monmouth, mainly because Geoffrey of Monmouth was so much more of a bestseller than he was, said that he had visited the site and he actually saw a second inscription saying, and this is Guinevere, his second wife. Second wife? What is that all about? First of all, no one else saw this, right? So I think Gerald's pulling a fast one there. But you know what? This whole Glastonbury Bones of Arthur thing doesn't stop there. When the monks announce it in 1184 and then in the 1190s, they're probably hoping not just to get tourist money, but to get royal interest. Because if you can get royal interest, then that's really good for your church and your abbey. But unfortunately, Richard I is on crusade, and then he's captured, and the kings are busy with other things, right? However, about a century later, in the reign of Edward I, Edward I is a very warlike king who spends much of his time fighting in Wales, trying to either conquer it or make clear that he rules it, depending on the time that you happen to catch him. And he sees this whole Arthur thing as a great opportunity. Says, they found Arthur's bones, and it's in England. And I'm fighting to liberate England too, just like Arthur was. And he goes in great state and makes a big deal out of Arthur being one of his own ancestors, and you know, the sort of history of the ancient kings of Britain. And he does this whole big ceremony of transferring the bones that they found, or you know, what bones were left at that point, transferring them into a tomb in a much more honored place. And he presides over it, and he basically takes it for himself. And that's just the beginning. He then goes back and starts this whole chivalric order of Arthur at his court, and builds a round table. You know, sort of himself as the ongoing Arthur. You can still see this. It's fabulous, actually. It's obviously just the the tabletop right now. It doesn't have the legs. But this thing is 5.5 meters across. And it's painted with, the painting was actually done in Henry VIII's reign, that Richard mentioned. But it's got 26 spaces for kind of, you know, squished knights, really. But it's a fabulous thing. And what he's doing here is laying claim to this Arthurian past as, you know, the king of England and the king of Wales. He's laying claim to the entirety of the British past. And of course, the irony here of him appropriating Arthur as one of his, you know, direct predecessors is that it's Edward that conquers Wales for the last time. Edward is the one, 1282, 1284, to effect the final conquest of Wales. And here he is, you know, sort of appropriating the symbol of Britain as well as the lands of Britain. Again, it brings us back to this question I mentioned last week. Who owns the past? Who has the right to talk about the past, to claim to possess the spirit of someone like Arthur or the Round Table or any of those things? This is a direct example of the appropriation of the past in this context. And from here we go into the medieval romance tradition. And this is very varied, very complex. I'm not going to go through it in huge detail. But the basic point here is that Geoffrey of Monmouth's work and the works of translation and of sort of reimagining that follow on from Geoffrey of Monmouth pass into European romance and become stories of their own in what is increasingly a sort of cycle of tales centered around Arthur. Arthurian tales, Arthurian tradition, etc. And a lot of tales that had been separate, like the love story of Tristan and Isolde, start getting attached to the Arthur tales and become part of this big body of Arthurian literature as it moves forward in time. You can look at some of these writings and trace at least the first appearance in writing of some of the great, the tropes that we know from the Arthurian period. The Round Table, this is the first place it's mentioned in something like its present form. The French writer Chrétien de Troyes is the first to have a full-scale Lancelot story, and that Lancelot story does involve a romance with Guinevere. He's also the sort of a guy that gets the Grail stories kicked off in an elaborate tale that then gets picked up and finished by others. And then there are others. This is just one more person that I mentioned because he's very important in the development of the Grail trilogy and of Merlin. So once these get going, as you can see from these pictures also, any number of new tales get told, and elements that might have once belonged to one cycle, Tristan and Isolde or whatever, the Grail cycle, for example, now begin to come together and be part of the Arthurian tradition as it grows larger and larger. And while we're on the subject of Merlin, I wanted to say something about him. He's a very interesting, kind of difficult figure to put your hand on. We believe that he has some origins in a Welsh figure, Merlin the Wild, who is a kind of madman, a bard, a prophet who goes mad after a battle and then runs off in the trees and swings around in the trees making prophecy. There are a variety of these figures, believe it or not. One of them, there's a northern one, Lailoch, and they all probably influence one another at certain points in time in terms of what they look like. But once again, it's Geoffrey of Monmouth that's the big guy for Merlin. He is the one to first tell the story of how Arthur gets conceived when Merlin, Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, wants to sleep with someone who is not his wife, and Merlin makes Uther look like that woman's husband, sneaks him in, and that's how Arthur gets conceived. Geoffrey also writes two more longer tomes on Merlin prophecies and the life of Merlin, so he's pretty important in that. And then by the time we get to these two, one early 13th century and one 15th century, what you're seeing is Merlin drawn into a Christian body of tale literature, including, by this time, the Holy Grail. And this guy, Robert de Boron, is particularly important for that. So it's gone a long way from the wild man swinging in the woods. And one of the leading ideas about how Merlin became Merlin is because, as some of you who've taken French may know, the word merde means shit. So it becomes Merlin in order to avoid that confusion. You can't have a prophet named that, let's put it that way. That brings us to another really out of the medieval period and into the, late medieval maybe, Mort d'Arthur, which Richard mentioned. We don't know who Thomas Malory was who wrote it. but he tells us he was writing it in prison, so there you are. We think he's a particular knight, but we're not quite sure. Clearly, the author had access to a variety of oral and written sources. This is probably the version of the Arthurian tale that more than any other, apart from Geoffrey, has influenced succeeding visions of Arthur, particularly modern ones. So one of the things that Mortar Arthur talks about is Guinevere's trial for adultery. Guinevere and Lancelot's trial for adultery. Well, any of you have ever endured some of the modern Arthurian films will know that that is A Knight's Tale, for example. Will know that that is part and parcel of this modern legendarium about Arthur. Mordred's treachery, Lancelot, etc. There are a lot of these things. Mortar Arthur's themes also very important. The ideas of chivalry, of virtue, of honor, but brought low by Arthur's failures in loyalty and love and in faith. And now we come to the really fun ones, the post-medieval Arthurs. Some of these are straight elegiac and praising of Arthur. Tennyson, that Richard mentioned before, imagines Arthur as presiding over a true, or at least aiming for, aspiring to, a golden age of chivalry, knightly virtue, etc. But the tone of that work is very elegiac. It's sort of an opportunity missed, an ideal that is reached for, but ultimately fails. And that is going to be a very important aspect of Arthurian representations in future years. And then, believe it or not, John Steinbeck was a big Arthur fan and a big fan of Tennyson as well. In fact, John Steinbeck actually lived near the place that's usually identified as Camelot and used to walk his dog there, practicing what he called the badger method of archaeology, which meant that he found a badger hole, he'd stuff it full of dirt, the animal would freak out and start, digging out the dirt, and artifacts would come flying out, which he would then collect. So I don't think we could recommend him for his archaeological stuff, but Steinbeck really was a big fan of Malory and of Tennyson, and this idea of the noble ideal, the implicit in the round table. And you see here his comment, apart from the Bible and Shakespeare, no one has influenced human morality more than Malory's Arthur. Some disagree with that. Mark Twain, some of you may have heard of him. He has a tendency to upset apple carts whenever there are apple carts to be upset. And he particularly loathes the kind of fake chivalry that he associated with the romantic medievalism of the pre- and post-Civil War South. This is my favorite thing. He refers to the sort of chivalry of this kind of Walter Scott, Ivanhoe sort of thing as the Sir Walter disease, if you can imagine. And look at this, the character of the Southerner would be modern, and the South fully a generation more advanced if it weren't for that brainless and worthless, long-vanished society. So much for Malory's Mortar Arthur and aspiration of courtly ideals, etc. And of course, Twain is also reflecting on some of the really dangerous aspects of this medievalism legacy that we mentioned last time, the chivalry of the KKK, for example, which he also, one of the things he really dislikes about Arthur is that he's not a Democrat. He's a monarch. He's aristocrat. He doesn't care for the common people. So there's a true political thing running here. And that brings me to the last few bits here. I want to run through some of our modern Arthurs to look at how they feature in politics. Richard mentioned T.H. White. This is one of the, along with Malory, he is probably, his work, The Once and Future King, which is published in very complicated series of redactions of books, etc., as you can see over a long period of time, His is probably, along with Mort d'Arthur, one of the most influential visions of Arthur and the Arthurian story in terms of how later people pick up on the story and tell it. If any of you saw Disney and you remember the character of Wart, that's where he comes from. This whole idea of the small child Wart, kind of annoying character, being tutored by Merlin. But T.H. White's big emphasis, he was a pacifist. And one of his big emphasis, his big focuses here is anti-war. And this book, he turns Arthur, the great hero Arthur, into a lesson about the destructiveness of war. So that Wart is tutored in this idea that might should be used only for the cause of right. Not might makes right, but might can only be subservient to right, might for right. He is very clear on this idea that heroism for no virtuous or moral purpose is the antithesis of justice. And his characters are quite interesting. It's really wonderful to read if you have time. Merlin is in here, and he has the characteristic of living forwards and backwards in time. So he actually foresees Hitler, and that's a reference in the book. Galahad is just annoying in the book. So. And then, of course, the Camelot of the Kennedys. Some of you may be old enough, I certainly am, to remember the ideal voiced by Jackie Kennedy soon after her husband's assassination, that, don't let it be forgot for one shining moment, there was Camelot. This idea, again, of a sort of ideal or utopian society that almost existed and then was destroyed by internal dissension or violence or what have you. Arthur and McCarthyism. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. I do not recommend it. This one is unbelievable, really. Not to mention, look at that helmet. I mean, tell me about that helmet. Not only does he look like he's wearing a cathedral in his head, it guards nothing on his face at all, right? So they went wrong just casting. Alan Ladd was actually a big cowboy star. And so he goes through this movie going, what are you going to do about it? Which is not Arthurian sort of thing. But this movie, too, had a political aspect. It's a rags to riches story about how this blacksmith rises through his own strength and everything to become a knight. And it's absolutely overtly pro-Western, anti-immigrant. There's one god-awful scene that involves Saracens attack. Islam arises in the Middle East, not in Britain, in the 7th century, attacking Arthur, 5th or 6th century, disguised as Vikings, 8th or 9th century, at Stonehenge, 3000 BCE. I mean, it's just painful. But the idea here was, it met a deserved fate. It was released in October of 1954, absolutely a pro-McCarthy sort of thing, and McCarthy falls in December. So it does not do well at the box office, shall we put it that way. Whoops. Sorry, I pushed the wrong one. This one, Arthur and Guinevere as freedom fighter, Clive Owen, Keira Knightley. Bob likes this, so I'm not going to say anything more about it, but I thought it was perfectly ghastly, but it may be a reaction to the kind of leather sports bra and tattoos of Keira Knightley. But here he's a freedom fighter who discovers his British heritage and decides to stay on to fight against corruption and injustice. This one, Legend of the Sword, very strange in many ways. It's very kind of pro-democratic. It's got the most diverse cast I think I've seen in any of these movies. And the round table has spaces for commoners, which is cute. It was widely received as a statement about Brexit, an anti-Brexit thing. And there's actually this great moment where Arthur says, you know, why have enemies when you can have friends, which seems apropos to Brexit. Jude Law makes a fantastic villain. And there's this weird, for those of you who are fans of The Little Mermaid, there's this weird Ursula octopus thing in the basement. No idea what that's about, but it's another use of the Arthurian myth. Arthur is a liberated man. The thing about the Arthurian tradition, we'll talk more about this next week with Robin Hood, is that it's all guy, all the time, up until the modern era. He is a sort of masculine uber hero in various ways. Mallory criticizes him for not being a great husband, so there's that. And Morris does as well. But basically, it's all a male, masculine gender tradition until the recent days, when any movie now that you look at is likely to feature an active Guinevere. Guinevere's first mention in the writing is that's dateable and that has a story attached to it, is in Geoffrey of Monmouth. There are clearly oral tales out there about her, and there's some speculation that she may be a sort of Celtic tale, Celtic goddess type. She matches the Celtic tale types in some way. But for the most part in Arthurian tradition before the 20th century, she either cheats on Arthur with Mordred or Lancelot, or she's abducted. And that's basically her range of action. In the 20th century, she's a lot more. There's that. There's that, deciding between Sean Connery and Richard Gere. Not going to help you make that choice, lady. There's whatever this is. And then now, of course, there's a whole range of Guinevere books. Started by the book I very unfairly dissed. Where is it? Mists of Avalon. I've got it somewhere here. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I very unfairly dissed in the last lecture, but now Guinevere is herself the hero of the whole series. And then Arthur is the beacon of hope, the hero who is not dead, who will come again. It's an idea that first appears in a Welsh source, 9th or 10th century, where they just call his grave a wonder, Annoeth, and then develops over time in a variety of other sources. It's a little unclear as to who Arthur is going to rescue. In some sources, it's the English. In some sources, it's the Welsh. And in some sources, it's the Bretons. So he's an all-purpose kind of non-dead rescuer in the tradition. And I had to end by pointing this one out. That whole idea of Arthur is not dead is brought up in this is amazing, 12-issue comic book, 1980s, where Arthur is accidentally resurrected by, I think, an archaeology student from his resting place. And he's brought out to fight an alien invasion led by Morgan Le Fay. He goes and resurrects all the others at Stonehenge. And then look at all the differences. So Tristan and Isolde, the great love story. Tristan's reincarnated as a woman. Isolde is also a woman. So there's a great deal of sort of gender and sexuality things to be worked out with Tristan there. Gawain, not a great knight. He just sort of hangs around missing his family. Galahad is a samurai. And this is the best. Guinevere is a U.S. military leader. I mean, the whole thing features interplanetary travel, and Arthur and Galahad blow themselves up. But fortunately, Guinevere is carrying Arthur's baby. And then Arthur is funny, the very last thing. If you have not seen Spamalot, oh, you must. You absolutely must. Not least for the mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries, the spam cans. But do you remember this in the 2020 election? Strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is a good way to pick. And so we'll end here with that question. Who was Arthur? Why do we care that whether he lived or not? Does that actually matter? And what is there about him and his legendarium that makes us want to fill in these gaps? So I'll end here.
Can everybody hear me?
No, you'll need this. That one? No, that one. Is that right?
Yes, everybody can hear me, I think. Okay. I'm Glennis Young, chair of the history department, and I'm really delighted to be in dialogue with Robin Stacey about a talk that has raised so many fascinating and important issues about our construction of the past and about our relationship to the past. So I would venture to say that when we think of Arthur in a very general way, even if we don't know that much about Arthur, we think about tradition. So what does the material that you've talked to us about tonight tell us about the nature of tradition and how we think about what tradition is and how we might think anew about what tradition is?
I think that's a really interesting and important question. I think we often tend to assume that tradition is fixed, that we think of tradition as something that is repeated over the years, sometimes even verbatim, right? Oral poems that are passed from one generation to another. And that, of course, can exist. But for the most part, tradition is a process. And what we're seeing, all of these works that we've been seeing tonight, the funny ones as well as the serious ones or the offensive ones, they're all part of building a tradition, the Arthurian tradition. And you'll notice as we went along that some of these works are based not on in fact, most of them are based not on the actual old stuff about Arthur, about the original Arthur, whoever he was, but are based on intermediary points. They're based on Mallory, or they're based on Geoffrey, or they're based on, the last one is based on this old myth about him living on. Tradition is a process, and I think that's a really important point to make about it, partly because we tend to assign so much authority to tradition. And I'm not trying to argue that we shouldn't assign authority to tradition, but I am trying to point out that we should understand what tradition is, how fluid it is, and then decide how much authority we're going to assign to it. And I think that's true of Arthur as well as other pieces.
Thank you so much, Robin. So I'd like to ask you to explore a little bit the third question that you've raised. What is it about Arthur that makes us turn to him time and time again and keep reconstructing him and deploying him for different purposes, political, economic, and so forth?
Again, I mean, this is a question to which I suspect many people out there will have different answers, because what we or anybody who is responding to the Arthurian tradition or to any tradition are working with are those aspects of the story that that make sense to us or that make meaning, that help us understand or interpret our own context. Arthur, I think, is just the right combination of not enough known to foreclose interpretations or options, but enough known or enough introduced over time to inspire many different reinterpretations going in many different veins. When you look at different directions, when you look at who Arthur is, I mean, he's brave, he's a hero. Great, got that. He's a king, got that. What does it mean to rule? What does it mean to be a hero? But he's also a hero of a king or a kingdom that disappears, that loses. He's also a king who is killed, who is betrayed, both in love and in politics. There are many directions in which you can take this Arthurian story and use it to explore ideas that you want to talk about or explore in your present-day context. And I mean, you can think about this through the series, but I think that's one of the things that the people that I'm fixed on in this series have in common, is that there's enough left to inspire thought without there being so much left that it forecloses it. And I think that, yeah.
Thank you, Robin. So here's a question, which, thanks to one of the students from Roosevelt High School, let's have a big round of applause for them. Thank you so much for coming. Follows very nicely, I think, on the question that you just talked to us about. So the question is, what other stories or legends in history follow the same pattern that Arthur did?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And a side question, an additional question, which ones don't? So who gets picked up for this interpretation and who doesn't? Because I think that's equally interesting. I mean, obviously, the people I've chosen to focus on in this series, I think, do. Robin Hood, next week, is going to be, I mean, there are some real similarities, right? They're both guy heroes. They're heroes in different ways. They sort of have love affairs. They sort of don't. I mean, there are a lot of similarities there. When you come to looking at something like the Templars, which we'll be talking about the week after that, there again, I think we'll find that there's enough known, but not so much known. There's a lot of mystery, so there's a lot of places that you could explore and find out more about. When you compare that to people who might be better known, let's see, I was trying to think of, Henry II, 12th century king of this cross-channel kingdom that I'm mentioning. He's talked about quite a lot, no question about that. He's one of the most important kings of the 12th century. He's, chronicles describe what he does. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine it becomes almost legendary. All of those things, right? But he doesn't attract, to my knowledge at least, this same sort of reimagining, I think in part because we know a lot about who he actually was. And he's not as much of a blank slate, I guess. But then you look at someone like Joan of Arc, and we will be talking about her. There's a lot of information known about her. I mean, the sources are really voluminous, as you'll see. But most of them don't come from Joan. They come from people writing about Joan or describing Joan's predicament or whatever. So I think there's this place in there where there are people who who invite that sort of speculation and others who don't. Did any of you ever see that horrendous Francis of Assisi film, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon? Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, Francis is it's sweet in a 1970s kind of put the rose in the barrel of the National Guardsman sort of way. Francis is another one. He's a kind of mystery figure. There's tons of information about him, but relatively little from Francis himself. And he also, he doesn't inspire nearly as much speculation as the people we've been talking about, but he also leaves a lot of holes to be filled. He has this intriguing life. He's a rich merchant who suddenly strips off all his clothes in the public square, renounces his wealth, and becomes the poster symbol for absolute poverty, for absolute religious poverty. Spends the rest of his life wandering around begging his living, not even taking enough food for the next day, right? Very dramatic figure, very performative figure. And he is one who gets reinterpreted a lot, because although, again, there are lots of sources about him, there are relatively few sources from within his perspective to tell us what he thought he was doing. So you get Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon is done at the absolute height of the sort of flower child movement. And you have Clare of Assisi, who, you know, in real life tries to follow him and ends up shut up in a convent because women can't be out on the roads in the 13th century. But in this movie, she's got long flowing hair and the white gown, and she's, you know, skipping through a field of poppies. Well, who is that film really about, right? It's sort of about Francis and Clare and sort of not. Or another way that Francis gets picked up on, he becomes a hero to liberation theologians down in South America. Why? Because of his message of absolute poverty. Because it's so radical and so compelling and so out there in terms of, do we understand it? No. So we make up stories about how that is. So I guess that's how I would answer that, with a few examples. And there are, of course, tons of examples out there of people who don't make it and people who do and people who are in the middle also.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question, and let's move from film to novels.
Uh-oh.
So let's say that someone wants to immerse themselves in contemporary Arthurian novels. What would you recommend and why?
Yak. Okay, so there's just no way to answer this without confessing that I just can't read them anymore. I feel horrendously guilty about that. I apologize. It's just too much Celtic stuff that I've actually taught, and I just can't do it. But honestly, I am aware that I loved Mists of Avalon when I first read it. I think the classic here, Once and Future King, is amazing, and I think you'd still enjoy it. It's funny, it's passionate, it's very relevant to the wars. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for, but I've got to admit, and I am sorry, I don't tend to read Arthurian literature.
Well, thank you so much, and I'd like to thank our audience for your questions. We didn't get to a few of them, so I'm sure Professor Stacey would be willing to be in dialogue with you. And again, thank you so much, Professor Stacey, for a talk that raises really important questions about our relationship to the past.
Thank you all for coming.